They didn't ask him to pull a trigger, they asked him to agree she deserved it, and somehow that felt heavier than any gun Ethan Cole had ever carried. The wind moved slow through the town square, dragging dust across worn booths and wooden boards, carrying the low murmur of voices that had already decided the ending. At the center stood the woman, Apache, her hands bound but her posture unbroken, dark eyes steady as stone, not pleading, not fighting, just watching like she knew something the rest of them didn't. Ethan stayed at the edge at first, boots planted in dry earth, coat hanging still, the kind of man folks forgot was there until it mattered, the kind who kept his distance from other people's trouble, because once, years back, he had stepped in, and it had cost him more than land or money could ever measure. "You see what she is?" someone said near him, voice tight, eager, needing agreement more than truth. "You know what needs to be done." Ethan didn't answer, his gaze fixed not on the crowd, not on the sheriff shifting uneasily with a hand near his belt, but on the woman's face, on the quiet there, the absence of fear where fear should have been. It stirred something old, something buried deep under years of silence and dust. The sheriff cleared his throat, voice catching as if the air itself resisted the words. "We're settling this now," he said, louder than needed, like he was convincing himself. Boots shuffled, a few steps closer, a few back, the tension stretching thin across the square like wire. Then someone pointed at Ethan, sharp, sudden. "You," the man said. "You've seen both sides out there, you know how they are, you stand with us or you don't stand at all." The words settled heavy, and just like that, the space around Ethan opened, all eyes turning, waiting, pressing, demanding a line be drawn where he had spent years refusing to draw one. The woman turned her head slightly then, just enough for her gaze to meet his, and in that brief moment, something passed between them, not a plea, not a demand, just recognition, as if she could see the weight he carried without him saying a word. The wind shifted again, lifting a strand of her dark hair across her face, and still she didn't look away. Ethan felt the past press in, the memory of another crowd, another day when silence had cost someone everything, and he had told himself he'd never stand in that place again. "Well?" the sheriff pushed, voice tighter now, the whole town leaning into the answer. Ethan took a slow breath, the kind that tasted like dust and old regrets, and stepped forward, not toward the crowd, not toward the law, but into the space between them, where no one else wanted to stand, and for a second, the entire town went quiet, like even the wind had stopped to see what choice a man like him would finally make. No one spoke when Ethan stopped in the middle, because that was not where a man like him was supposed to stand. The crowd shifted, boots grinding against dry wood and packed dirt, the sound small but sharp in the silence that followed. The sheriff glanced from Ethan to the woman, then back again, like he was hoping one of them would make this easier for him, but neither moved. Ethan kept his hands loose at his sides, far from his belt, far from anything that could turn this into something louder than it needed to be. He had learned a long time ago that the loudest choices were not always made with noise. "You are making a mistake," the man from before said, stepping closer, voice low now, less certain. "This is not your business." Ethan finally looked at him, not angry, not challenging, just steady, the kind of look that made a man hear his own words twice. "That is where you are wrong," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying farther than it should have in the still air. "It becomes my business the moment you ask me to agree with something I know is not right." A murmur moved through the crowd, softer this time, uncertain, like wind brushing through dry grass instead of driving it flat. The woman watched him, her expression unchanged, but something in her eyes shifted, a flicker of something that might have been recognition or memory. Ethan took another step forward, close enough now to see the dust on her sleeves, the faint line where a cord rested against her wrist, close enough to notice the small silver pendant hanging against her chest, half hidden beneath the fabric. His breath slowed. The world narrowed. That pendant was not just silver and stone, it carried a shape he had not seen in years but had never forgotten. The sheriff cleared his throat again, louder this time, as if trying to pull the moment back under control. "Ethan," he said, using the name like it was a warning. "This town needs a decision." Ethan did not look away from the pendant, from the way it caught the light for just a second as the wind shifted. He remembered a different day, a different sky, a woman pressing something small into his hand and telling him that some things were meant to find their way back. He had not believed her then. He had buried that memory with everything else he had tried to leave behind. But now it stood in front of him, breathing, waiting. "You already made your decision," Ethan said, still calm, still quiet. "You just want me to carry it for you." That landed heavier than any shouted word, and several people looked down, avoiding his gaze, as if the truth had weight they were not ready to hold. The man near him took a step back without realizing it. The sheriff hesitated, fingers tightening then loosening at his side. The rope swayed slightly in the breeze, untouched, forgotten for the moment. Ethan finally lifted his eyes to meet the woman's again. And this time there was no distance left in that look, only a question that did not need to be spoken. She gave the smallest shake of her head. Not in fear, not in refusal, but in warning, as if she understood what that pendant meant and what it could awaken. Ethan felt the past settle into place, piece by piece, and for the first time in years, he did not step away from it. Instead, he reached slowly toward his coat, not for a weapon, not for anything the crowd feared, but for something much smaller, something that had waited long enough to be seen again. His fingers moved slow, deliberate. Like every inch of motion had to pass through memory before it reached the present, and when his hand came out from inside his coat, it held something small enough that most men would have missed it if they were not already watching him like their next breath depended on it. A second pendant, nearly identical. Silver worn smooth by years instead of days, the same shape, the same stone set in the center, catching the same narrow line of sunlight that slipped between two buildings and landed right there in his palm. The air changed, not with sound, but with weight, the kind that settles in a man's chest when something he does not understand begins to matter. Ethan did not raise his voice, did not step closer. He simply let his hand lower until the pendant hung between him and the woman, a quiet answer to a question no one else had heard. Her eyes dropped to it for the first time, and that was the moment the stillness cracked, not outward, but inward, something behind her calm shifting just enough to be seen by the one man who knew what to look for. "Where did you get that?" the sheriff asked, but his voice had lost its edge, curiosity slipping in where certainty had been. Ethan did not answer him, because the answer was not for the sheriff, not for the crowd. It belonged to a different place. A different time, one that had been buried under dust and silence. He remembered the heat of a long summer afternoon years ago, a woman lying against the shade of a broken fence miles from any town, her breathing shallow, her hand pressing that same piece of silver into his palm as if it carried something more than metal. She had not asked for anything, not help, not promise, just said, "If you ever see this again, you will know what to do." And he had nodded without understanding, because sometimes a man agrees before he knows the cost. The crowd shifted again, quieter now, the earlier certainty thinning like fog under the sun. A man near the back took off his hat without realizing it. Another stepped sideways, giving space that had not been there before. The rope above moved gently with the breeze, no longer the center of attention, just a piece of forgotten wood and fiber. The woman lifted her chin slightly, her gaze returning to Ethan, and this time there was no warning in it. Only recognition, as if two paths that had been walking separate miles had just crossed without either one planning it. "You know her," someone whispered, not loud enough to claim, but loud enough to spread, and that was how doubt began, not as a shout, but as a question no one could fully answer. Ethan let the pendant in his hand fall still, then slowly bent, not in submission, not in surrender, but in something closer to respect, placing it carefully on the ground between them, in the exact space where no one had wanted to stand just moments ago. Dust settled around it, sunlight holding steady, and for a long second, no one moved, because whatever was happening no longer belonged to the crowd, and they could feel it slipping beyond their control without understanding why the pendant rested in the dust like it had always belonged there, catching the light in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And for the first time since the shouting began, no one in the town square seemed certain of what they were looking at. The sheriff took a slow step forward, then stopped, as if crossing that invisible line would mean stepping into something he did not understand, his voice quieter now, stripped of authority. "Ethan, what is this?" Ethan did not look at him, his eyes still on the small piece of silver between them, because whatever answer there was did not belong to law or order, it belonged to memory. The woman shifted slightly, just enough for the pendant at her neck to slip free from the fabric, both pieces now visible, twin reflections of something older than the moment, and a murmur moved through the crowd again, softer than before. Like wind finding cracks in dry wood. A man near the front squinted, leaning forward as if seeing clearer might bring back the certainty he had lost, but instead he only found more questions. They are the same, someone said under their breath, and that was enough, because once doubt takes root, it does not need to be loud to grow. Ethan straightened slowly, his movements unhurried, giving the silence time to settle, giving the truth time to find its own shape. There was a woman, he said at last, his voice even, not raised, not forced, just placed where it needed to be heard. Years ago, out past the North Ridge, alone, hurt, but still standing the way she chose to stand. The words hung there, not dramatic, not pleading, just real, and that made them heavier than anything shouted before. The sheriff frowned slightly, not in anger, but in confusion, trying to connect something that did not fit into the rules he knew. She gave me that, Ethan continued, nodding once toward the pendant in the dust. And she told me if I ever saw its twin, I would know I was standing in the wrong kind of crowd. No one laughed, no one interrupted, because something in the way he said it made it clear this was not a story meant to entertain. The woman's eyes lowered again, not in shame, not in fear, but in something closer to acknowledgment, as if the past he spoke of had not been lost to her either. A breeze moved through the square, lifting dust in a slow spiral around the two pendants, and for a moment it felt like time itself had paused to let the truth settle where it needed to. The man who had spoken first earlier stepped back again, more noticeably this time, his confidence thinning into something uncertain. And others followed without thinking, small steps, barely visible, but enough to change the shape of the crowd. The rope above creaked softly, forgotten now, just another piece of wood in the wind. Ethan finally lifted his gaze from the ground and looked at the people around him, not with challenge, not with anger, but with something far quieter, something that asked a question none of them had prepared to answer, and in that silence, it became clear that whatever choice they thought they had made was no longer theirs to hold. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned, like ice under slow weight, each man feeling it give beneath his own thoughts before he dared to look at another. The sheriff shifted again, this time taking off his hat, not out of respect, not yet, but because something in his chest had begun to press against the certainty he had worn like a badge. You are saying this woman? He started, then stopped, because even he could hear how uncertain it sounded now. Ethan did not rush to fill the gap. He had learned that truth did not need pushing, it only needed space. The Apache woman finally moved, just a single step forward, enough for the sunlight to catch both pendants at once, hers and the one resting in the dust, twin pieces reflecting the same quiet history. She looked down at it, then back at Ethan, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, carrying without effort. My grandmother wore one like that. The words landed gently, but they carried farther than any shout had earlier, because they did not demand belief. They invited it. Ethan gave a slight nod, not surprised, not relieved, just acknowledging something that had already settled inside him before she said it. She was found near the North Ridge, he said, his tone unchanged. She was alone, but she did not ask to be saved, she only asked that what was right be remembered. A man near the front swallowed hard, glancing down at his own hands as if they might tell him something different than what he was starting to understand. Another stepped back fully now, turning his body slightly away from the center, no longer part of what had been forming. The crowd did not disperse, but it loosened, like a knot pulled just enough to slip free. The sheriff looked from Ethan to the woman, then to the pendant on the ground, and for the first time since this began, he did not look like a man ready to give an order, he looked like a man trying to understand one. Why did you not say this before? He asked, quieter now, almost to himself. The woman met his gaze without hesitation. Because you had already decided what I was before you asked who I was? That settled into the space between them with a kind of finality that needed no reinforcement. A breeze moved through again, carrying the smell of dry wood and distant earth, and with it came a shift no one could deny anymore. Ethan bent slightly, not to pick up the pendant, but to brush the dust away from it, revealing the full shape, the same markings, the same careful work that spoke of hands that made things to last beyond a single lifetime. He straightened again, eyes moving across the faces around him, not searching, not accusing. Just letting them see what they had nearly ignored. No one reached for the rope now, no one spoke of what had been moments ago so certain. Instead, there was only the quiet weight of something changing, something unseen but undeniable, and in that stillness, it became clear that the choice they thought they were forcing on one man had turned, slowly and without warning, into something each of them would have to answer for on their own. No one gave an order, but the square began to change anyway, not with sudden movement, but with the kind of quiet shifting that happens when men start listening to something they cannot ignore. A boot scraped back against the wooden platform, then another. Each small step creating space where moments ago there had been none. The sheriff looked up at the rope, then away from it, as if it no longer belonged to the decision he was supposed to carry out. His hand dropped fully from his belt, fingers flexing once before settling at his side. "Untie her," he said finally, but it did not sound like a command, it sounded like a man accepting something he should have seen sooner. No one rushed to do it, not out of defiance, but because the urgency had drained from the moment, replaced by something slower, heavier. One of the older men stepped forward instead. Careful, deliberate, as if correcting a mistake rather than completing a task. The woman did not move until the last restraint was gone, and even then she did not step back, did not turn away, she simply stood there, free in a way that felt quieter than the tension that had held her before. Ethan remained where he was, neither approaching nor retreating, watching the way the crowd avoided looking directly at her now. Not out of hatred, but out of something closer to shame. The pendant still rested between them, untouched, and for a moment it seemed to hold more authority than any badge or voice in the square. The sheriff cleared his throat again, but this time there was no speech prepared, no charge to read, only a man standing in the space left behind when certainty collapses. We did not have all the facts," he said, the words awkward, incomplete, but they were all he could offer. The woman met his gaze, not with anger, not with forgiveness, just with the same steady calm she had held from the beginning, and somehow that made it harder to stand in front of her than any accusation could have. Ethan bent once more, picking up the pendant from the dust, brushing it clean with his thumb before holding it out to her, not as a gift, not as something owed, but as something returning to where it belonged. She hesitated only a second before taking it, her fingers steady, her eyes never leaving his. "You remembered," she said quietly. Ethan gave a slight nod. "Took me longer than it should have." A faint shift passed through her expression then, not quite a smile, but something close, something that carried both acknowledgment and distance. Around them, the town continued to loosen, people stepping back fully now, turning away, conversation starting in low voices that did not carry, as if the need to be loud had left them entirely. The rope swayed once more in the breeze, empty, forgotten, just another piece of wood above an empty platform, and in the middle of it all, the space where Ethan had chosen to stand remained, not claimed by anyone else, not filled, just there, quiet and undeniable. A reminder that sometimes the hardest place to stand is the one that changes everything without a single shot being fired. The square did not empty all at once, it unraveled, threads of people drifting back toward doorways and shaded porches, voices low and careful, as if speaking too loud might pull the moment back into something it no longer was. Boots that had once pressed forward now turned sideways, then away, leaving open ground where tension had stood thick enough to feel. The sheriff stepped off the platform slowly, each step measured, like a man relearning how to walk without the weight he thought he needed. He paused near Ethan, not close enough to claim anything, not far enough to avoid it either, his eyes lingering on the pendant now resting in the woman's hand. "You could have said nothing," he muttered, more to himself than to Ethan. "And none of this would have touched you." Ethan looked out across the town, not at any one person, just at the space where something had shifted. "That is exactly why it would have," he said quietly. The sheriff let that settle then. gave a small nod, the kind a man gives when he does not fully understand, but knows enough not to argue. The woman turned then, not toward the crowd, not toward the road, but toward Ethan, her steps light, unhurried, each one deliberate, like she had already decided where she belonged in this moment. Up close, the dust on her clothes caught the light differently, no longer dull, but textured, real, carrying miles of ground and time within it. She held the pendant between her fingers for a second, then slipped it back beneath the fabric near her collar, where it rested as if it had always been there. "My grandmother spoke of a man who listened when others would not," she said, her voice calm, steady, shaped by something deeper than the moment they stood in. "I did not think I would meet him standing in a place like this." Ethan shook his head slightly, not dismissing her words, but not claiming them either. "He did not always listen," he replied. "Just once when it mattered most." Her eyes held his for a moment longer, searching, not for proof, but for something that could not be spoken. Then she gave a small nod, the kind that closes a distance without erasing it. Behind them, the town continued to move, quieter now, slower, as if each person carried a piece of what had just happened and was not sure where to set it down. A door creaked open somewhere. A horse shifted its weight near a hitching post, ordinary sounds returning in careful steps. The rope above hung still now, untouched by wind, no longer part of any story being told. Ethan took a step back, then another, not leaving in a hurry, just giving the moment back to itself. The woman watched him for a second, then turned toward the far end of the street, where the land opened beyond the last row of buildings. Neither of them spoke again, because whatever needed to be said had already found its place. And as the sun began its slow drop toward the horizon, casting longer shadows across the boards and dust, it became clear that nothing in that town had been forced to change, not by threat, not by command, but by a single quiet refusal to agree with something that had once felt certain. The sun dipped lower, stretching shadows across the town like long, quiet fingers, and for a while no one seemed willing to step fully back into the life they had paused. Ethan moved toward the edge of the street, boots slow against the dust, not looking back, not needing to, because he could feel the shift behind him. The way a place breathes differently after something breaks and settles into a new shape. The woman walked in the opposite direction at first, toward the open land beyond the last building, her steps steady, unhurried, as if she had always known the path would clear eventually. But after a few yards she stopped. The pause was small, almost lost in the movement of wind and light, but it was enough. She turned slightly, not fully. Just enough for her voice to carry back across the distance. Between them, Ethan. He stopped without turning right away, the sound of his name landing in a place he had kept quiet for years. When he did look back, the town sat between them, empty space where a crowd had been, boards and dust holding the memory of something no one would speak of the same way again. She stepped closer now, closing part of the distance, her gaze steady, thoughtful. "There is something you should know," she said, her voice softer than before, not meant for the town, only for him. Ethan waited, saying nothing, because he had learned that the most important things were never rushed. She reached beneath the fabric near her collar again, pulling the pendant into the light, turning it slightly so the stone caught the last line of sun. "My grandmother did not give that to just anyone," she continued, her eyes meeting his. "She gave it to someone she believed would carry a choice forward when she no longer could." Ethan's brow tightened just slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of a weight he had only begun to understand. "She told me," the woman went on, "that one day I might meet a man who would stand where others would not, and that if he still carried what she gave him, then I would know the path ahead was not meant to be walked alone." The words settled between them, not heavy, not light, just certain, like something that had been waiting for the right moment to be spoken. Ethan glanced down at his hand, now empty where the pendant had been. Then back at her, the space between them no longer feeling like distance, but like something shared. Behind them, a door opened, then closed, life beginning to return in quiet pieces, but neither of them moved toward it. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of open land and distant hills, and for a moment the town felt smaller than it had before. "You are not tied to this place," she said, not as a question, not as an invitation, but as a truth she had already seen. Ethan looked past her, toward the horizon where the light was fading into something softer, something uncertain but open. He had spent years staying where nothing changed, convincing himself that stillness was the same as peace. Now, standing there, he realized it had only been waiting. The choice had not ended in the square, it had only begun. And as the last light caught the edge of the pendant at her throat, he understood that whatever came next would not ask him to stand between right and wrong again. It would ask him to walk forward. And this time, not alone. The last light slipped behind the hills, leaving the town in that quiet hour where everything slows and nothing feels certain. And for a long moment, neither Ethan nor the woman moved, as if both understood that what came next would not be decided by words. A lantern flickered to life somewhere behind them, then another, soft yellow light replacing the sun, but neither of them turned toward it. The town had its place, its rules, its noise, but out beyond the last building, the land opened wide, untouched by what had just happened, waiting in a way that felt older than any of them. Ethan took a slow breath, the kind that settles deep, then stepped forward, not toward the center of town, not back into what he had known, but toward the open ground where she stood. The distance between them closed without effort, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, like two paths finally meeting after running parallel for too long. She watched him come closer, her expression calm, but her eyes held something new now, not just recognition, but acceptance, as if the choice had already been made long before this moment arrived. "You could stay," she said quietly, glancing once toward the town, not as an offer, not as a suggestion, just as a truth he could still choose. Ethan followed her gaze for a second, taking in the wooden buildings, the narrow street, the places where he had spent years saying nothing, doing little, staying out of everything that might ask more of him than he was willing to give. It looked smaller now, not because it had changed, but because he had. He shook his head slightly, not in rejection, but in understanding. "I stayed long enough," he said, his voice even, certain in a way it had not been before. She nodded once, as if she had expected that answer, then turned toward the open land again, the pendant at her throat catching the faint lantern light as it moved. Ethan took one last look back, not at the people, not at the place, but at the space in the center of the square where he had stood, where something quiet had shifted everything without force, without noise. No one watched him now, no one called his name, and somehow that felt right. The wind moved through again, carrying dust and distance, and with it came a feeling he had not known in years, not peace, not yet, but something closer to direction. He adjusted his hat slightly, then stepped forward beside her, not leading, not following, just walking. The town faded behind them with each step, its lights growing smaller, its voices disappearing into the night, until there was only open land, wide and waiting. Neither of them spoke again, because some journeys do not begin with words, they begin with a choice made in silence. And as they walked into the darkening horizon, it became clear that what had changed was not just the moment, not just the town, but the path of a man who had finally understood that justice does not need to be loud, to be real, and sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is simply refuse to stand where they are told.